Welcome. Today we're diving into some of the most intriguing concepts in property law, focusing on transfers involving unborn persons, the rule against perpetuity, and key doctrines like election, ostensible ownership, and more. These principles form the backbone of how property rights are managed and protected, especially when dealing with complex family and trust arrangements. We'll break down each concept, provide real-life examples, and clarify the legal reasoning behind these rules. Let's start by understanding what it means to transfer property to someone who isn't even born yet. Property law: a transfer can be made to a person who does not exist at the time of the transfer, an unborn person. However, this is not as straightforward as it sounds. The law requires that the interest created for the unborn person must be absolute and cover the entire remaining interest of the transferor. In other words, you can't just give a slice of your property to someone who isn't born yet and then keep the rest for further transfers. The transfer must be complete and final for the unborn beneficiary. Since a transfer can only be made to a living person, the law requires that the property be vested in a trustee or another living person until the unborn beneficiary comes into existence. For example, if one wants to transfer property to his future son, he must first vest it in a trustee, who will hold it until the child is born. This ensures that the property is managed and protected until the intended beneficiary is capable of receiving it. Let's look at a practical example. Suppose A transfers his property under a trust deed to B, the trustee. The trust is for A and his wife during their lifetimes and after their deaths to their eldest son. If the interest created for the eldest son is only for his lifetime, and not the entire remaining interest, the transfer is invalid. The law insists that the unborn person must receive the whole remaining interest, not just a temporary or partial benefit. Famous Tagore versus Tagore case clarified the law on transfers to unborn persons. The Privy Council held that a transfer to someone not in existence at the time of the transfer was void. To address this, Section 13 of the Transfer of Property Act was introduced, allowing such transfers if the entire remaining interest is given. This case set the foundation for how property can be passed on to future generations. It's important to distinguish between a life interest and an absolute interest. If a transfer gives only a life interest to an unborn person, it's not valid under the law. The interest must be absolute, meaning the unborn person gets full ownership, not just the right to use the property during their lifetime. This ensures clarity and prevents complications in future transfers. In the Sofer v. AG of Bengal case, a will vested a bequest in favor of persons not yet born at the time of the testator's death, with certain conditions. The Privy Council found the transfer invalid because it did not cover the whole remaining interest. This case reinforced the principle that only an absolute interest can be given to an unborn person. Next, let's explore the rule against perpetuity, a crucial concept that prevents property from being tied up indefinitely. The rule ensures that property remains transferable and does not get locked away for generations. It was first announced in Whitby v. Mitchell and later incorporated into Section 14 of the Transfer of Property Act. Perpetuity refers to an interest in property that is meant to last forever or for an excessively long period. The law restricts such interests to ensure that property can eventually be freely transferred. If a transfer creates an interest that takes effect after the lifetime of living persons and the minority of someone in existence at the end of that period, it is void. Cadle v. Palmer case is a classic example. A trust was created for 120 years based on the lives of 28 named persons, and then for a further 21 years. After both periods, the property would go to those then ascertained. The House of Lords held that the transfer was valid for those in being and for 21 years after. This case illustrates how the rule against perpetuity operates in practice. English law allows the period of perpetuity to be a life or lives in being plus 21 years, with an additional period of gestation at both ends. Indian law, however, limits it to the life or lives in existence at the date of transfer plus the minority, up to 18 years of the beneficiary. The period of gestation is only added at the beginning, not at the end. Suppose X transfers property to his posthumous child A for life, and then 21 years after A's death to A's children. Under English law, this is valid as the period includes gestation A's life and 21 years. In Indian law, the property would vest in A's children at 18 with no extra gestation period at the end. This difference can affect whether a transfer is valid or void. If a transfer is made to A for life and then to A's son when he marries, the marriage could happen beyond the allowed period of perpetuity. If there's even a slight chance the gift could vest outside the permitted time, the transfer is void. This strict approach ensures property doesn't get locked up for too long. For example, if a transfer is made to A for life and then to his eldest son at 25, but the maximum allowed period is only up to 23 years, child's age plus 21, the transfer is void. The law is clear: if the interest might vest outside the allowed period, it cannot stand. Now let's discuss conditions attached to property transfers. A condition precedent is one that must be fulfilled before the property vests in the beneficiary. If the condition is met, the property is transferred. If not, the transfer fails. The rule of Sippers applies, meaning substantial compliance is enough. For instance, a transfers Rs. 10,000 to B on the condition that B marries with the consent of C, D, and E. If E dies but B marries with the consent of C and D, the property still goes to B as there's substantial compliance. But if B marries without any of their consent, the condition is not fulfilled and the transfer fails. Condition subsequent is different. Here, the property is already vested but can be taken away if a certain event happens. The condition must be strictly fulfilled. For example, if A transfers money to B but if B marries without C's consent, the money goes to D. If B marries without consent, D gets the money. The doctrine of acceleration applies when a condition subsequent is fulfilled. The estate is divested from the original beneficiary and passes immediately to the next in line. This ensures that property doesn't remain in limbo and quickly finds its rightful owner. If a condition precedent is impossible or illegal, the transfer fails and the previous estate becomes absolute. But if a condition subsequent is illegal, the estate remains vested and the condition is ignored. This distinction is crucial for understanding how property rights are affected by different types of conditions. The doctrine of election is another key principle. It states that if someone takes a benefit under a will or instrument, they must also accept any obligations attached to it. This prevents a person from accepting the good parts and rejecting the bad, often summarized as not being able to blow hot and cold. The leading case, Cooper versus Cooper, established that a person who benefits from a transfer must also accept any burdens it imposes. For example, if A gives C's property to B and also gives C a benefit in the same deed, C must choose, either keep the property or take the benefit, but not both. For the doctrine of election to apply, three essentials must be met. The transferor has no right in the property, the transferor confers a benefit on the owner, and both the transfer and benefit occur in the same transaction. The owner then has the right to choose between the property and the benefit. The person must accept or reject the transfer in totality. Partial acceptance is not allowed. If the person accepts the benefit, it is presumed they have elected, especially if they enjoy the benefit for 2 years. If they do not elect within a year, the law may deem them to have accepted the benefit. If the person required to make an election is under a disability, such as being a minor or mentally incapacitated, the election can be made after the disability ends. The Limitation Act provides up to 3 years for making the election after the disability ceases. The doctrine of ostensible ownership deals with situations where someone appears to be the owner of property but is not the real owner. If a person buys property from the ostensible owner in good faith and for value, the real owner cannot later claim the property provided certain conditions are met. In Lakshman versus Kalicharan, A made it appear that his wife owned a property. She sold it to D, who bought it in good faith. When A's son tried to recover the property, the court protected D, the innocent purchaser. This case highlights the protection given to buyers who act in good faith. For the doctrine to apply, the transferor must be the ostensible owner with the real owner's consent, and the transferee must pay consideration and act in good faith. If these conditions are met, the real owner cannot set aside the transfer, even if the ostensible owner had no real title. Normally, no one can transfer a better title than they have themselves. However, the doctrine of ostensible ownership is an exception. If all conditions are met, the transferee gets a good title, even if the transferor was not the real owner. Feeding the estoppel is a principle that allows a transferee to claim property if the transferor later acquires a valid title. For example, if A sells land he doesn't own but later inherits it, the buyer can require A to deliver the land. This prevents unfairness and protects the buyer's interests. In Smith versus Osborne, a transferor sold land he didn't own but later acquired it. The court held that the buyer could claim the land under the principle of feeding the estoppel. This ensures that buyers are not left empty-handed due to technicalities. For this doctrine to apply, the transferor must have made a fraudulent or mistaken representation, the transferee must have acted on it, and the transfer must not be forbidden by law. If the transferor later acquires the property, the transferee can claim it. This doctrine does not apply to a bona fide transferee for value without notice. If the transferee knew the real situation or if the transfer was forbidden by law, the doctrine cannot be invoked. The courts look closely at the facts to ensure fairness. The doctrine of lees pendens means that during the pendency of a lawsuit involving property, neither party can transfer the property in a way that affects the other's rights. This prevents parties from undermining court proceedings by transferring disputed property. In Bellamy v. Sabine, E sold property to S but E's son sued to set aside the sale. While the case was pending, S sold the property to B. The court held that B did not get a valid title as the property was under litigation. This case illustrates the protective purpose of lees pendens. For lees pendens to apply, the transfer must occur during a pending suit, the case must be in a competent court, it must not be collusive, and the litigation must specifically concern the property. The doctrine does not prohibit transfers, but any transfer is subject to the court's final decision. A case is considered pending from the date the suit is filed until a final decree or order is passed and fully satisfied. This ensures that property rights are not disturbed while the court is deciding the matter. Lees pendens does not apply to cases where the right in question is a personal obligation, not tied to the property. For example, a wife's right to maintenance is a personal right, so the doctrine does not affect property transfers in such cases. If someone buys property in good faith and makes improvements but is later evicted by someone with a better title, the buyer can claim compensation for the improvements. This principle, rooted in fairness, ensures that honest buyers are not left at a loss. In Ramsden versus Dyson, a tenant built on land believing he had a right to do so. When the real owner evicted him, the tenant could claim the value of the improvements. This case established the right to compensation for bona fide improvements. If the bona fide holder has growing crops on the property, they are entitled to those crops and can enter the property to collect them. This ensures that investments made in good faith are protected, even if the holder loses the property. A transfer made with the intent to defeat or delay creditors is considered fraudulent and can be set aside by the affected creditors. This rule ensures that debtors cannot escape their obligations by secretly transferring property. In Twins' case, a debtor secretly transferred all his property but kept possession. The court found this to be a badge of fraud and set aside the transfer. This case is a classic example of how the law protects creditors from deceitful debtors. The rule against fraudulent transfers does not affect the rights of bona fide transferees for value or insolvency law. If a debtor prefers one creditor over another, it is not considered fraudulent. The law looks at the intention behind the transfer. If a transfer is made to defeat subsequent transferees or involves fictitious creditors, the law allows the affected parties to set aside the transfer. Courts have consistently protected genuine creditors and ensured that property cannot be hidden from rightful claims. Wrap up: property law contains several safeguards to ensure fairness, clarity, and justice in the transfer of property. From rules about unborn beneficiaries in perpetuity to doctrines like election, ostensible ownership, and protection against fraud, these principles work together to balance the interests of all parties involved. Understanding these concepts is essential for anyone dealing with property rights, whether as a lawyer, buyer, or inheritor.